I introduce to you Dr. Howard C. Estep, President of World Prophetic Ministry, bringing the first in a series of Bible study lectures from the Old Testament book of Daniel. These messages were recorded before a Bible study audience in the beautiful King is Coming Auditorium at Colton, California. With your Bible open, listen now as Dr. Estep is beginning to speak from Daniel chapter 1.
If you'll open your Bibles to the book of Daniel, chapter 1, we shall begin our 12-week study of this most interesting book. And I've said many times, and I believe this can be substantiated, if you thoroughly grasp and understand the book of Daniel, you will have a good overall study, understanding of Bible prophecy throughout the whole Bible. I consider Daniel a primer of Bible prophecy, and if you learn Daniel, you'll understand all the other because it all fits together. I have an outline for us. The first chapter, 1, Jerusalem besieged in Daniel's day. That's chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. The second point, Daniel and his companions chosen, verses 3 through 6. 3, their names were changed, verse 7. 4, Daniel takes a stand for his God, verses 8 through 11. 5, the Hebrews tested and the result, verses 12 through 16. 6, God always blesses those who stand firm, verse 17. 7, God's people are superior to others. That's verses 18 through 21. Then if we have time, we'll go into the first 13 verses of chapter 2. Chapter 1 of Daniel, the first part, Jerusalem besieged in Daniel's day, verses 1 through 2. Verse 1, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, and we know when that was, it was 607 BC. History bears this out. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. Daniel lived in Jerusalem, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. God allowed the king of Judah to be taken captive and to be overrun by Nebuchadnezzar and part of the vessels of the house of God. Now the Babylonians were a pagan people. They had a temple called the Temple of Baal. And so they take these beautiful goblets that God had inspired various artificers to make, maybe a pomegranate on one, a flower on another, something beautiful engraven on each goblet. We find these goblets are taken down to Babylon, and they're going to be desecrated, used in the temple of the god of Baal. We don't see these goblets again until we get to the 5th chapter of the book of Daniel, where Belshazzar has a feast. And then the goblets are brought out to drink a toast to the pagan gods of Babylon. So we have here Jerusalem besieged in Daniel's day. We have the record of it, 607 BC. We know that the vessels in the house of God, part of them, were taken off to Babylon in the land of Shinar, so forth. Now we look at our second part, and Daniel and his companions chosen. This is verses 3 through 6. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes. In other words, King Nebuchadnezzar is searching for unusual Jewish men of high intellect because he's going to use them in his school of protocol. These men are going to be instructed, taught for 3 years in a special school in Babylon to serve at the king's table or to serve in an advisory capacity for the king. So we find this in verse 3. The king spake unto the master of his eunuchs that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes. Qualifications for these men. There's 8 qualifications. 1, they must be princes. They had to be of royal blood, royal order. 2, they must be youths. They must be young teenage men. 3, without blemish physically. They had to be physically in good shape. 4, handsome, good in appearance. 5, well educated, skillful in wisdom. 6, skillful in knowledge. 7, proficient in science. 8, refined and polished so as to be able to stand before kings. These are young ambassadors being chosen for the protocol of Babylon. And you have to bear in mind that Daniel is a young man. He's not an old man. He's not even middle-aged. He's in his teens. Daniel had been instructed from his youth in the way of Judaism. Evidently circumcised at the 8th day, and he had followed all of the customs and the rituals of the Judaism in his family, and so then quite suddenly he's uprooted, and he's taken 400 miles east to Babylon in the land of Shinar, into a pagan religion. They worship gods of the sun, completely pagan worshipers. But he wasn't a pagan worshiper. He worshiped God Almighty. And so we find that he is being chosen because as we go a little bit further in verse 4, children in whom was no blemish, well favored, skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. History records 2 main periods of science, the Greek period from 600 BC to 200 AD, and the modern period from 1450 AD to our day. Science began in Egypt and Babylon with the birth of mathematics, metallurgy, and anatomy, astronomy. To the Babylonians, we owe the exact measurements of the lunar and solar cycles, the tracing of the paths of the planets, the division of the circle into 360 degrees, and the designation of the constellations, notably those of the zodiac. You see, all of that originated in Babylon. So Daniel had to be an unusually smart, intelligent man, and those with him. We had the requirements put forth in verse 4. Verse 5, and we're looking at Daniel and his companions chosen. Verse 5, and the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat. Daniel's diet, his menu, is going to be altered. He evidently practiced the dietary laws under the Jewish religion set forth by Moses. But now he's in a strange country. His customs are different. Those of us who have been recently in the lands of the Bible on a tour, note that the food is different over there. When you go from your country to another country, the food is different. The seasoning, the spicing, the manner in which it's served, all of it is different. Daniel ran across that because the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat according to Babylonian customs, and of the wine which he drank. So nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. This 3 years refers to the length of this school, where these young men are going to be trained in protocol. They're going to take a course in the science of government. Because Babylon was not a nomadic tribe, it was a highly civilized country. When we read books relative to ancient Babylon, we are amazed at the manner in which they constructed, the things that they built. Absolutely fascinating. And so you're not thinking or talking about a nomadic tribe, you're talking about somebody that's highly civilized. Great mathematicians, tremendous science. And so we find here that they're going to spend 3 years. But notice up in the latter part of verse 4 it says, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. This learning could have been a special department in the palace school for couriers, young men. So that they selected from the Jewish prisoners, or those taken prisoner when Nebuchadnezzar invaded Babylon, they selected certain intelligent, handsome young men who had the possibility of being tremendous scholars. Verse 6. Now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These are the Jewish names of these young men. You're going to find that their names are going to be changed almost immediately, because they're going to take these young men and brainwash them. They're going to school them. They're going to saturate them in the sciences and the learning and the wisdom of ancient Babylon. And so they don't want them having Hebrew names. They're going to give them Babylonian names. And we get that in verse 7 in our third part, where their names were changed. Verse 7, unto whom the princes of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. So these men got new names. And let's just see the meaning of these names. We find that Daniel, in the Hebrew, the meaning was God is judge. In the Babylonian, Prince of Baal, or which was the chief deity of Babylon. So this man's name, Daniel, in Hebrew, God is judge. Now it's changed to Belteshazzar, and it means the chief deity of Babylon. Hananiah meant in the Hebrew, gift of the Lord, renamed Shadrach. In the Babylonian, command of Aku, A-K-U. The command of Aku, the moon god. The moon god. Mishael, meaning in Hebrew, who is what God is. Renamed Meshach, who is Aku. For Azariah, meaning who loveth Jehovah, helps. Who loveth Jehovah helps. Renamed Abednego. And in the Babylonian, servant of Nego, the god of science and literature. All of them are given pagan names. Now, these men are not Christians, let's face that. Sometimes we get mixed up in our phraseology in the terms of identifying people. The Hebrew people were not Christians. They were first called Christians at Antioch. And this refers only to New Testament believers, but these young men were godly men. They believed in Almighty God. Under the economy of Judaism, based upon the 10 laws God gave Moses on Sinai, which Moses stretched to 496 points of the Mosaic Law, and in that he covered the dietary laws, rules, regulations, everything that man needed to know about life. And then when Christ came on the scene, they had taken those 496 Mosaic laws, originating from the original 10, and stretched them into 5,000 traditions of men. But Daniel in Babylon is a godly young man. And these 3 young men with him are very godly. So now we're going to see what happens. Their names were changed to Babylonian names. The fourth part, Daniel takes a stand for his God. And this is so often difficult to do. In a foreign land, or under pressing circumstances, even at your local daily vocation, sometimes it's difficult to take a stand for God. So here we have Daniel. He's had his name changed. Now we're going to see him take his stand for God, beginning in verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, because the king had decreed, in verse 5, certain diet for these young Hebrew men. We don't know for sure, but we're assuming, most logically, that the animals which are being served for meat in the Babylonian dining hall are animals which were sacrificed to pagan gods. They were not killed according to the plan of Judaism. Definitely they were not kosher. So he's going to be called upon to eat meats, not killed the proper way that Moses instructed them. And so he purposes in his heart, in verse 8, he says that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. As I say, evidently there were certain things on the king's table that a Jew couldn't eat. Therefore he requested in the middle of verse 8 of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself, because he's going to rub himself the wrong way religiously. It's rather interesting today. Our Supreme Court does uphold religious convictions to a certain degree. Different people have different ideas about which is the day of rest. Others have various ideas about paying into the IRS and into various segments of the government, the Amish people, different ones. And the Supreme Court has upheld their convictions. It's rather interesting that in this great nation of 226 million people, that there is a segment called the Supreme Court that will listen to what that minority has to say about matters. Now Daniel is going to stress his part, because it says in verse 9, now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. In other words, God turned the eunuch's heart toward Daniel. God has this ability. God can speak to all kinds of people and turn their hearts. And so God spoke to the pagan captain of the eunuchs, and he turned his feeling toward Daniel. Very interesting. Verse 10, and the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? In other words, there were a lot of Hebrew taken prisoner. And so he's going to check these Hebrew young men, because they are requested to eat the Babylonian diet. It's like being called into the army or the Navy. You can't take your rations with you. You eat what the Army eats, what the Navy eats. And if you have consequences, that's your problem. So Daniel rebelled. He's taking a stand. And he's taking a very sensitive stand, because the latter part of verse 10, then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. This head of the eunuchs, who is responsible for their diet, for their meals, he's saying in so many words to Daniel, if you don't eat what the king has purposed, then you're going to cause me to go to the chopping block. You'll cause me to be executed. And God had turned the eunuch's heart toward Daniel. So there's a controversy raging there. And it's quite interesting to see how Daniel is victorious in this matter, because in verse 11, then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Daniel is talking back to him. So Daniel is taking his stand. Now the Hebrews are going to be tested. They're going to be put to a strong test, and the results are fascinating. In verses 12 through 16, prove thy servants. Daniel is talking to Melzar. Prove thy servants. And when he says prove thy servants, this was a test of challenge to Daniel's faith in God. There must have been an element of the miraculous in the result, for 10 days is not long enough to be able to tell a difference because of the eating of certain foods. 10 days you can't tell. There isn't that much difference. But he says in verse 12, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days. Give me 10 days. Let us keep eating our Jewish diet. We don't want to eat the king's meat. We don't want to drink the king's wine. Give us 10 days and let them give us pulse. If you know anything about vegetation, this could only consist of vegetables and grains, wheats, barley, rye, peas, beans, lentils, etc. We were in Canada several years ago, and we stayed at the Empress Hotel. In those days, ministry allowance or ministry rate was $7 a night for 2 people. We stayed there for 3 days. And it's about $100 a night now. But anyhow, we stayed at the Empress, and we enjoyed especially going down into the garden dining room for breakfast. They had a breakfast food called Red River. It consisted of several kinds of grains. Canada's great on growing grains. And that was so good. We ate that every morning, and we brought 3 or 4 boxes back with us. So here's a man, a teenager, and he's saying to his pals, and he's saying to the man in charge of them, instead of us eating the normal diet, which is against our religion, which does not adhere to our way of eating foods, it wasn't butchered or killed according to our way, let us eat cereal. Now, not cornflakes. So he said, let us eat pulse. And what else? Give us water to drink. We don't want your whiskey. We don't want your wine. We don't want any of your liqueurs. Just give us pulse. We'll eat that for 10 days. We'll drink water. At verse 13, then let our countenances be looked upon before thee. After 10 days, call us in. We'll stand at attention. We'll pass inspection. And the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat. Contrast us. Put us on one side. Put those that eat the king's meat, let them on the other side. And then you look at us. Make up your mind. And the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. He's putting himself right out there to be examined and to be dealt with very sternly. Verse 14, so he consented, Melzar, to them in this matter and proved them 10 days. This word prove is that he permitted them to eat this for 10 days. Quite interesting. These boys, young teenagers in a foreign land, instead of eating what was put before them, they said, no, we don't want it. On religious grounds. Strictly religious grounds. And I think sometimes today we make a mistake in our testimony because we don't really take our stand religiously. We're somewhat afraid to let people know where we stand. And so people don't know whether we're Christians or not Christians because you can't look at a person and tell what they are. But here's a young man with his companions, Jewish ancestry, in a foreign land, pagan country, Babylon, and they're taking their position. And so what is going to happen? And at the end of 10 days, their countenance appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. After 10 days. Now, basically, 10 days isn't enough time. You can't possibly have an improvement in 10 days. When man can no longer do anything, then God steps in. So here we have it in verse 15. At the end of 10 days, their countenance appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar was convinced. He was convinced, took away the portion of their meat. In other words, he didn't bring it to them anymore. He didn't bring it to them the first 10 days. So he just took it away. He cut it out of the diet. He said, you boys don't have to eat this. Notice what it says. And the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse. Now evidently they ate this for 3 years. Because this was a school where they're training for protocol, being trained in science and knowledge and wisdom and understanding of the Babylonian cult. And evidently these boys ate this for 3 years. Proving that your diet doesn't have to be changed. And I can prove that because we ate pinto beans and cornbread for years down south when we were growing up as kids. Mom never came in, Dad never came in and said, we're going to change your diet. We're going to go chickpeas for 60 days. He never said that because all we could get was pinto beans. $1.98 a hundred. You can't buy them that cheap today. So on this same diet, these boys really worked beautifully. Because you'll notice God always blesses those who take a stand. If you don't take a stand, God doesn't bless. If you don't let your colors be seen, God has no avenue of blessing you. If you don't rise up in your locality and let it be known that you are a believer, that you are a born-again child of God, you'll never have the opportunity to shine your light. And so this boy has that opportunity, and then God blesses him. Notice in verse 17, and as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill. God gave it. This confirms the supernatural element in the training of these 4 young men. God blessed them physically when they took a stand for a proper diet. And as for these 4 children, young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Daniel had a special gift of God in understanding all visions and dreams. Because as we go through the book of Daniel verse by verse, you're going to find that it was Daniel who was always called when the going got rough. When one of the pagan kings wanted a problem solved, it was Daniel who appeared on the scene. But right here in the first chapter of Daniel, it's God who gives him this special wisdom and special understanding in all dreams. So God always blesses those who stand firm. We come to the last part of chapter 1. God's people are superior to others. Now we're not to go around high-hatting anyone. We're not to go to someone and say, oh, I'm better than you are. My blood is different. In Virginia years ago, people used to let it be known to you that they came over on the Mayflower. And that was a big thing down in colonial Virginia where we lived many years ago. Quite often you'd meet some dowager lady and she would take her glasses, and let you know that she came over on the Mayflower. Well, dear old Will Rogers cooked the goose of those people. He said, yeah, you came over on the Mayflower, but it was my people who met the boat. Because he came from the Indians. Now we have God's people are superior to others, beginning in verse 18. Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. This is at the end of the 3-year period. You see, in this chapter 1, you cover several years. At the end of the 3-year period, verse 18, now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king communed with them. The king evidently was a very brilliant man. He discussed matters pertaining to science, various fascinating subjects involved in his vocabulary. He communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel. Of all of these students who had had 3 years training in a special school, none of them was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. 4 Hebrew young men in a foreign land are outshining in wisdom and knowledge and understanding, far ahead of all of the Babylonian young men. Therefore stood they before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding, all matters, that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. 10 times better. This is an idiom meaning many times better, not actually 10 times, but many times better. These young men. Why? Because God blessed them. Why did God bless them? Because they took a stand. What was their stand? They refused to go along with the crowd. Daniel was raised in a strict Hebrew environment, and he was taught to go by the letter of the Word. And when he got uprooted temporarily into a foreign land, he stayed by the letter of the Word. Note what it says in verse 21. And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. What does this mean? He continued in office the rest of his 70 years captivity. Daniel was in Babylon for 70 years. And during his whole 70 years, while he was a captive in Babylon, he evidently continued in his office, stayed in a place of respect, because we find the angel Gabriel coming to Daniel in the 9th chapter of the book of Daniel and revealing some marvelous, magnificent prophecies that have to do with us living today. So evidently Daniel remained a godly man from his teenage youth right on up through his period while he was living in Babylon. Tremendous individual. Let's look at chapter 2, see if we can cover the next 13 verses. I've divided it into 4 parts. 1, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, verses 1 through 3. That's chapter 2. The second part, the king's strange demand, verses 4 through 9. 3, his wise men fail him, verses 10 through 11. And lastly, number 4, the king unleashes his anger, verses 12 through 13. This is chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. And in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams. You notice in the Babylonian language they say this twice. Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams. What else do you think he would dream? That's about the only thing I ever dream is dreams. So Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams wherewith his spirit was troubled and his sleep brake from him. Then the king commanded to call the magicians. He awakened. He awakened out of his sleep. He couldn't rest. He was disturbed in his mind. He had this dream. It troubled him. He awakened. Verse 2, then he commanded the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans for to show the king his dream. He forgot his dream. It was so terrible it awakened him. Couldn't go back to sleep, but he couldn't remember it. I've never been able to figure that out. If that dream was so terrible and so awful, how come he can't remember it? So they came and they stood before the king. Verse 3. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. So all the king could tell the wise men of his dream was that he had had the dream and that it greatly disturbed his spirit. That's all he can tell them. So what's he going to ask? He's going to ask them to recall the dream. And that's a hard cookie, I'll tell you that. If you come up to me in the morning or tomorrow night and you say, guess what I dreamed last night? I wouldn't have the faintest idea. And if I did, I wouldn't tell you because you'd think I was being personal or something like that. You know, here's this magnificent, powerful king sitting on the throne. He's known as the head of gold, the most powerful kingdom in all the world. And he has a dream. He forgets it. He calls his wise men in. And he says, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Now we're going to get the king's strange demand in verses 4 through 9. Verse 4, Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, this is Aramaic, O king, live forever. This is the way they greet royalty. O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. You tell us the dream, and we will give you the interpretation. That's why I never go to palmists. You know, these women, usually it's women. I don't know why men are never palmists. Have you ever figured that out? And they trace these lines and they say, this line here is a long line, that's your life. I read a book on it one time. And, you know, or they look in the crystal ball. I never go to those people. You can look at a person and you can tell if their eyes are close together, they are concentrators. And this greasy looking woman looking into the crystal ball, she can look at you and tell where you're a concentrator or not. Or if your eyes are wide apart, she knows that you got your nose in everybody else's business. See, and so you know, and if your ears are large and they go back to your head rather than stick out like that, she knows you're neat and there's an element of godliness in you. You see, when you study all these things, I could throw a sheet over my head and sit at the crystal ball and look you in the eye and pretty well tell a lot of things about you. And you always tell them nice things because they've paid you $15. You're sure not going out and tell them you're going to be a stinker from everybody you meet. You tell them nice things. So these fellows came in to the king and he said, "Oh, live forever, king. Oh, live forever." They knew he couldn't live forever. He's going to die like everybody else. "Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation." Happy-go-lucky crowd. These magicians, these astrologers. Then the king answered, and he said to the Chaldeans, "The thing is gone from me. I've forgotten it. I can't remember it. If ye will not make known unto me the dream, with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut in pieces. Woo! Ye shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill." He sure got bitter all at once. He sure hasn't read how to make friends and influence your enemies, I'll tell you that. So he's threatening them already. He said, "You got to tell me what the dream was and the interpretation. If you don't do it," verse 8, "But if you show the dream and the interpretation thereof, ye shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and the interpretation thereof." These are the brilliant men of his kingdom. These are the fellows who have worked out the zodiac. These are the fellows who are the masters of science. These boys are intelligent. Verse 7, "They answered again and said, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation of it. Then the king answered and said, I know of a certainty that ye would gain the time." In other words, the king said, "You're just fooling around. You're killing time. You're trying to get the best of me. You're hoping that I'll remember it because I want to know the interpretation so bad. If I remember it, I'll tell you what it is." But he said, "You're just killing time here." And that's what it says there in the middle of verse 8. "Then the king answered and said, I know of a certainty that ye would gain the time because ye see the thing is gone from me." It's gone from me. I can't remember it. You're just beating around the bush. Verse 9, "But if ye will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you. For ye have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that ye can show me the interpretation thereof." That's a pretty good example. If you can recall my dream, I don't worry about the interpretation. I'll just take it for granted that you'll know the interpretation if you can do that. Now notice what happens. His wise men fail him completely. Verses 10 through 11. The Chaldeans answered before the king, and they said, there is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Well, they told the truth. Nobody can do that. They told the truth, thus making it all the more clear that Daniel got his dream and interpretation from God. They said to the king, listen, this is an impossibility. Nobody can do that. Nobody can recall a dream that you had and only you had and give the interpretation. Impossible. Middle of verse 10. There is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore, there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asks such things at any magician or astrologer or Chaldean. And they said, you're the only man that's ever asked such a thing. Nobody's ever asked anything like this. Nobody can do it. You've asked the impossibility. And what this is doing, this is making Daniel's stock go up. In the office of Payne Weber in Babylon, it went right up to the top. Because he's really going to cash in. He's going to have certificates of gold in just a little bit. Verse 11. And it is a rare thing that the king requireth, and there is none other that can show it before the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. So they're saying, and they must have believed that somewhere out in the universe there was a super god, because the Babylonians worshipped many gods. So that's why they make the statement here, except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. So then what's going to happen? The king's going to get furious. His anger is going to be unleashed upon these fellows, and we get that in verses 12 through 13. For this cause, actually, the king got mad because they were taking issue with it. They kept talking back to it. And they contradicted him. He's the king. He has the ability to do whatever he wants to do. And so these men in his kingdom contradicted him publicly. And verse 12 says, and for this cause the king was angry and very furious, and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Now who does that take in? It takes in Daniel and his 3 Hebrew companions, because they are numbered among the wise men of Babylon. So the command goes out for these wise men to be destroyed. And we pick that up in verse 13. And the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain. And they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. But you see, God is the God of the impossible. God would not work if it was not in the miraculous way. God doesn't do the humdrum everyday things. God steps in when we come to the end of our ability. When we stand at wit's end corner. When we come to the point where we absolutely can do nothing else, and our resources are all used or involved, and we've come to the end of our limits, then God takes over. And so here in Babylon, some 2,500 years ago, the book of Daniel is just beginning to be written, enacted out on the stage of time, to be recorded in this book which we have called the Bible, the Old Testament. And so God allows this situation to prevail so God might be the victor under all of these circumstances. Because when we get into the 2nd chapter, you'll find that Daniel has a prayer meeting. Just a simple prayer meeting. And in the prayer meeting, God touches his heart and his mind. And Daniel remembers the dream, or the dream is given to Daniel. And Daniel has the ability to recall the dream. He has the ability to interpret the dream. And we find this all through the book of Daniel. Meaning to say, if we stand faithful to God, God will meet all of our needs, and God will deliver us, and God will see us victorious.
You have heard Dr. Estep deliver the first Bible study lecture from Daniel, chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 13. On the other side of the cassette, you will hear a continuation of this Bible study series.